Well, I'm here with Brian Godawa, a screenwriter, a storyteller, and we're here at Peaceful Science. We're trying to build trust between the public and scientists, and one of the ways we build trust is by telling stories and thinking about how science connects with the stories that are out there. And Brian is a master storyteller. Can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and how you ended up on this podcast, or why I might have invited you is maybe a better way to put it?
Yeah, I think we kind of crossed paths over Michael Heiser, wasn't it? Pretty much some of the Michael Heiser stuff.
Michael Heiser, I also sent you a copy of my book before it came published. Yeah.
That's right, you did. You did actually.
You're a little bit too busy at the time, and I was kind of a nobody, so you weren't ready to take a look at it yet. But then you did read it recently, right?
I did. I recently read it, and
I
thoroughly enjoyed it. Yeah, absolutely. And well, you know, I've always been an artist. I started out as a visual artist when I was younger, but then as time went on, I loved the movies, and I started to study and pursue storytelling, and particularly for the movies. And so I started a movie career, you know, years ago with my first movie, To End All Wars, which was a POW story, true POW story starring Kiefer Sutherland, and it, you know, was award winning and stuff. So it was really great. And that sort of launched my film career. But I haven't, you know, I've done a few films since then, some documentaries, etc. But in the process, you know, it's a tough world. Filmmaking and movie making is a very difficult world to maintain a strong income on. So you sometimes have a few bad years, you know, before it picks back up again. And I was going through my John Travolta moment before Pulp Fiction, right, where you know, I had a couple bad years, and so I had to reevaluate and, you know, just sort of expand my storytelling. And I was looking into several things. One of them was writing novels. And so I had written this novel, I'd written a screenplay about a Bible story that I thought, okay, no one's done it like this. I was studying this amazing, interesting, phenomenal research about ancient history and during this time period. And I thought, you know what, this would be a perfect movie for both Hollywood and the religious community, because it would be Hollywood because it's fantastic. It's got some really amazing things like, you know, watchers, angels, and giants and stuff like that. And I thought, you know, and of course Christians would like it because it would be biblical in that sense. And so I wrote this screenplay, and it's called Noah Primeval. And that was right around
what year was that you
oh gosh, that was like 2010 or 11 or something like that. No, like 2010. And so,
so help us out here to understand. So you're a screenwriter, you're doing it for a living. You had a screen. I mean, how much work did it take to turn that into a novel? Was that like a multi-year process, or just like a couple months? Like, what are you talking?
Well, okay, so it takes, you know, of course, every case is dependent, but on the average, you know, you might take like 6 months to be able to, you know, research and write a script that you're doing. Sometimes longer, sometimes 8 months if it's really detailed, or if it's historical or something like that, you know. And in my case, you know, it was roughly something like that, 5 or 6 months to write it. But then,
and to give people a sense of how it goes, I mean, it is a novel. It's like a fictional novel,
right? I'm talking about the screenplay right now. So I did that, and then I discovered Darren Aronofsky was making a movie on Noah, and I thought, oh well, you know, he's got connections. I didn't have that many connections, so I knew my chances were not great. So I thought, well, how can I get my story out before his so I don't look derivative, right? And I realized, well, I've got to adapt it into a novel. I never wrote a novel yet, right? And sure enough, I mean, as time showed, his movie was nothing at all like my story. There might have been a few little pieces that he, you know, picked up on in terms of research, but he just went off into this bizarre secular environmentalist worshiping parable, you know. So so that was great, but the point was that it inspired me to write the novel, and I had the time to do it anyway. And even then, it took me about, you know, I don't know, I think maybe 5 or 6 months, because it was my first novel. And I also, you know, had an editor, so I needed to do rewrites and stuff. So I was learning a lot as I was going. So I was an expert storyteller in screenwriting, but a novel storytelling is different, you know. So it's a learning process as well for me there. And so it took me about, I think something like 6 months to write the novel. And I put the novel out, and to be honest with you, it's called Noah Primeval. That's the first of a long series of novels that I wrote, and we could talk about that later. But
Chronicles of the Nephilim. Right?
Chronicles of the Nephilim, right? So I retell Bible stories with fantastical elements like giants and watchers and supernatural stuff, you know. And you know, so I add some fictional elements, but I try to stay true to the Bible. And but I was using a lot of imagination there because that was a time period where I'm basically an evangelical Christian, and I had always been an artist, and I would always love the imagination. But you
started as a young Earth creationist too. Were you a young Earth creationist at that time, or you kind of moved more to older?
No, no. As a matter of fact, researching Noah was part of the process of me changing my mindset, realizing how much, because what happened was I realized how much the language and culture of the ancient Near Eastern world is very alien to us. And so I was beginning to realize, I was actually reading Biologos material, which, they were not scientific concordists, which means they don't argue that they don't believe that the Bible concords with science, so it's two different worlds. And so they don't necessarily have to meet. And I was studying and discovering that a lot of the language that when we read the Bible, we bring our cultural baggage to it without even realizing it. And especially when we're reading it in English, we're not necessarily picking up the idioms, the figurative assumptions of the culture and stuff, as well as a lot of their paradigm, the way they see the world. So the more I began to explore that, I began to see how different it was, and
your work also seems to echo like Michael Heiser in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and well, Michael Heiser was the guy that basically opened my mind to write the Noah novel. So I discovered his work online before it was even a book. He was just an academic who was throwing here's the book I'm writing. So I was able to access it before it even came out, and that's what inspired me, and that's what helped me discover a theological theme and thread through the Bible that I had not seen before, that was very biblical. It's not like it's Gnosticism or anything like that. It's there, but it's in the ancient Near Eastern context, and we miss it with our modern Western bias. So that was all part of that package, and I was and exploring and coming to the conclusion that while I'm not an evolutionist. I'm no longer, as a young Earth creationist, you're very fearful of the evolutionary science, because if it's true, you've linked your science to the scriptures. So if evolution's true, then the scripture's false, right? And that's the dichotomy that I was struggling with. But as I study the ancient Near Eastern context, I've concluded that it's, Genesis is not a science book, and it's not giving the physics of the universe. There's more theological messaging going on there. And so I came to the realization that, if evolution's true, it's okay. So if I can be persuaded scientifically, I'm okay with that, Now, I have not studied it as in depth as I want to eventually, but nonetheless, my point was that it freed me to be able to explore the imaginative aspects of the scriptures, and also not be afraid of the science, and that was a major turning point for me. And so that's why I'm open to actually, whereas before I wasn't as open to reading evolutionary theory written, by Christians or, whatever, whether they're what is it? Creation.
It's evolutionary creation. Imagine how it could be true. So that kind of creates a space where you can actually hear about it. Rather than feeling like you already know from the outset that this is going to be a major problem and it's false. And
exactly.
And so it kind of neutralized it. And it wasn't really even about the science. It was really just about looking at scripture more closely.
Because that's my heart. I'm not a scientist. I'm an artist, and I'm a storyteller. And the ancient Near Eastern culture, there's so much of it that it was like this. So this was through reading Michael Heiser's work. That's when it opened this like amazing doorway that helped me to see things differently, and that's what inspired me to apply that imagination to my storytelling of the Bible, to my own theology. So in other words, as an artist, I've always loved the imagination. I've always been able to embrace it and enjoy it. But I also had a spiritual life that I tended to live differently. I tended to live more like a rational, intellectual type of approach, my faith. So I've loved apologetics. I've studied philosophy and all that. But, I had always been struggling with, how to integrate both of those. And, it's a lifelong struggle. But my point is that I got to that point where I was able to understand a little bit better how to apply imagination to my faith without denigrating it. And that's what the novels Chronicles of Nephilim became. And I was actually a little bit afraid that Christians would reject it because, the evangelical culture, I was worried that they don't get the imagination as much, and fundamentalists tend to not be open to stuff like that. But I was shocked and surprised that it was embraced. It became a bestseller. It was just selling like hotcakes. And I realized, oh, there's more stories here to tell. And I started a whole series that have now been most all bestsellers. And I applaud the Christian world. I think that a lot of Christian world really does get it, and they understand this approach to imagination without, shall we say, without negating or jettisoning your reverence for the scriptures, if that makes sense.
Well, in a lot of ways, I think, especially when you're talking about the Old Testament, the historical way it's been studied was with midrash, right?
Yeah.
Which is like trying to have imaginative expansions to think about and explore all possible ways that it could be understood.
Yeah. In fact, that was consciously, I read this book by Pete Enns before he jumped the shark, but I think it was his, like one of his dissertation, and it was put into a book. I can't remember the name of it now. Sorry. But anyway, it was addressing this very issue of how the ancient Jews would retell their biblical stories, and thus not just midrash, but I mean, thus you have, many books in the pseudepigrapha, the apocrypha, jubilees, a lot of these books are retelling biblical stories, but they're sort of, contextualizing them within their own context, right? And so that was a major inspiration for me, because I wanted to retell these stories, but sort of be consciously aware of some of the paradigms of today. Like, for instance, the one very popular understanding, or shall we say paradigm, is this ancient aliens. It's a conspiracy theory in my mind, but it's the belief that the ancient religions and all the stories about being visited by angels are actually visitations by aliens from other planets, and because man was so ignorant, they misunderstood it as gods or deities, right? And of course, Ancient Aliens is a super popular, sort of fake history program, and I wanted to sort of retell those stories with the supernatural element return to it, and that was one element of what I was doing. There's many aspects to storytelling, but that was certainly one of them.
Yeah, because you're not saying like every single thing you imagined was true. You're just having fun with the story. And there are parts, you are a Christian who really believes that parts of the stories are true.
Right.
But scripture doesn't tell us everything. You can't actually tell the whole story without having to imagine pieces to fill things in. Right?
Exactly. And by the way, saying that doesn't mean I don't believe there aren't, and it's not possible to have life on other planets. I have no problem with that. I'm just saying there's, the evidence isn't there for it now. And so, and the attempt to the attempt to subvert the religious narrative with a pseudoscientific narrative is one of the elements of storytelling that, I think we need to talk about, because I think if you look throughout history, it is one of the dominant, shall we say, motives of storytelling is what I would call subversion. And what that is if you want to affect a culture, cultures are embedded with traditions. We know this, and of course there's multiple traditions, et cetera. But in general, people are very traditional. They figure out their sort of pathway and their history, and they stick to it, right? And so they're not going to be open to other narratives. And this has been all throughout all of history. And so if you seek to try to communicate a new narrative to a culture, you're not going to be successful if you just come in and speak on your own terms within your own paradigm, because in many ways they won't understand it, won't make sense to them. So one of the ways you do that is one of the ways you connect, that you truly do make that connection, and actually in a way to try to persuade them, is through subversion. So what you do is you enter into the cultural narrative that you're engaging with. I'll call it the opponent, right? The opponent narrative. You enter into that.
Or maybe the other culture's narrative.
And of course, that could be anything, that could be, and I'm not talking about, some culture across the seas, even within our own society. You have to understand, well, what are the dominant
person's their story, and you tell their story in a slightly different way, right?
Exactly. And like Francis Schaeffer used to call it the thought forms. You have to understand, well, what are the dominant thought forms, the dominant sort of stories that are retold in this culture? And you take those and you retell them, but you invest them with new and different meaning that is more oriented towards your worldview. And then what happens is that creates the connecting point between cultures where they'll understand the sort of the shallow elements, and it draws them into the story. And then you persuade them because you're actually creating new definitions of the words. And so this is what goes on all the time. I mean, you watch Hollywood movies, and this is why, you'll see.
Kind of also what my book did, right? Like I took the Young Earth Creation story, and I wouldn't say it was subversive in some sort of dishonest way. I'm very clear what I'm doing, right?
Yeah.
And I mean it. And I kind of basically say, we want to have Adam and Eve as ancestors of everyone, but Scripture isn't talking about genealogy; it's talking about genetics, and let's tell the story that way.
Yes, and you did a good job in that, and that's one of the reasons why I enjoyed your book and was drawn to it, because you understood how to do that. And I do want to clarify here, unfortunately, the word subversion does have negative baggage to it, and I don't use it in a negative sense. Subversion, and another element is sometimes people think of subtlety, like subversion is like, oh, you don't know what's happening. Well, there are plenty of approaches that are very bold and obvious and of that subvert, and I don't mean it in the negative way. I simply mean that the way to sort of change the cultural narrative is to be able to first work within it and guide it to another pathway, right? So this is why we see
it's not like about conquering another point of view. It's about entering that worldview and kind of refining it in a way.
Yeah, it could be conquering, because if it is a different paradigm, like this is what we see, in the Hollywood movies about Bible stories, right? The movie Noah and the movie Exodus, Gods and Kings. Those were both movies made by atheists who hate God, written by atheists who hate God, and they're tales that are retelling Bible stories, but they're subverting the narrative of the Bible by depicting the God of the Bible as a temper tantrum throwing child, an angry murderer, he's this vengeful guy, and so in so doing, that's how they sort of change the biblical narrative, right? Or like I said, Aronofsky, I mean, he basically took the biblical story and changed it so that it was the sin of mankind was not a relationship with God, related in a relationship with God. The sin of mankind had to do with polluting the earth. And so he did a good job of subverting the narrative into something the opposite of what the original was. And so that's, I write, I was so.
It means that there's like this base storyline that if we don't engage it, we're not going to really be in conversation with people.
Exactly.
But so if we do engage it, the details of how we retell it end up being actually maybe where all the meat is, and how we kind of deviate from that story and how we don't.
One of my inspirations was the Acts 17, where it's the famous chapter that all apologetics people point to, because it's the only place in Scripture where you see someone, a Christian, sharing the gospel with pagans or unbelievers. And so they all go to that passage. But what's interesting was I wrote this in my book, The Imagination of God, because it was a study that I
interject. Brian, you generously gave us a copy of that to share with our listeners. So we'll have that on our patron site by tomorrow for sure. So thank you for getting it's a really interesting read, kind of talking about your story through this. But back to Acts 17.
Acts 17. So I kind of, when people go through that we know that he's talking to the Stoics and Epicureans, but he's addressing certain doctrinal beliefs of the Stoics and countering with his own understanding. But I examine the passage and I go through it step by step, and I show that what he's really doing is retelling. He's subverting the Stoic narrative. He's retelling the Stoic ideas, but he's investing it with new meaning. And so, for example, he'll quote, like, the passage where it says, as your own poets say, right? That we live in him, we live and move and have our being. Well, interestingly, yeah, if you know what that verse actually means, it doesn't mean anything of what we would as Christians mean or Paul would have mean, right? It actually means that Zeus was actually literally in all beings with the spark of life. And because humans were still alive, that meant Zeus was still alive, that kind of a thing. But Paul doesn't make those qualifications at first. He just quotes it and says, hey, but think about it on the surface. As Christians, we would argue God sovereignly controls all things. And so in him, we live and move and have our being. See? And so in a sense, he's kind of agreeing with them on a shallow level. And he goes through all these various beliefs of Stoicism, and he's retelling the narrative, because the Stoic narrative was, the Logos is in everything, and man, there's a creation, fall, redemption. Logos is in everything. And the fall is that, humankind, lost this inner knowledge of their own spark of divinity within them, etc. And so the redemption is they have to find that spark within them, the secret knowledge, etc. Right? So there's this narrative going on, and they certainly reject the resurrection as well. But Paul starts retelling that, and then at first he's like agreeing with them, all your poets have said this, and you're religious people, etc. But then eventually, as they're drawn into the narrative, he starts to show how his meaning is different. And that's the power of story is it draws you in with that which you're familiar with, but then it gives the twist. Like when you watch a good thriller, like one of my classic examples I love, is The Sixth Sense, right? You're watching this whole movie, and then the twist at the end, near the end, is like, oh my gosh, he's dead, and then it suddenly changes the meaning of everything you've seen before. Well, that's what the twist in a story does. And that was what Paul was doing. So by the time he gets to where he says, and he will judge the world in righteousness by a man, who rose from the dead.
He's on the rock of judgment, which is called Areopagus. Yeah. So they're saying that Ares is going to judge you. And they're saying, no, actually, we are at the rock of judgment, but, it's not going to actually be Ares that judges. It's going to be this man Christ that does.
Yeah. and which was offensive on many levels, including that he rose from the dead, right? But he holds that, he saves that till the end, till at least enough of them are brought into the journey to be able to listen. And of course, at the end of the story, some still reject him, but some accept him. But that's just one example that I was drawing from, that I feel like this is what we need to do in our discourse in general, is become better storytellers. You've done this.
Let's go down here. I want to talk about science for a moment and how this is important, because I think part of what's going on here is, first of all, I think people neglect how imagination plays a role in science and how story plays a role in science. And I think that leads to a lot of confusion and conflict, because what you're talking about makes a lot of sense when we're talking about, Paul talking to Greek
philosophers.
Yeah. Okay. Because that's, all of us are even sure if we trust scripture. It's all a little bit squishy anyways, right? But science is supposed to be giving us the facts about the world. That's like a lot more clear and we can take hold of. But I think there's a couple things here that I think are worth interjecting into this. First of all, when it comes to science, it's really driven by imagination. I mean, we can't really even test any of our theories until we imagine the possibility that they might be real and the possibility of other things that might be similar to them are. And then we look at them with evidence. So even the idea of like hypothesis testing is really driven by imagination. If we don't have the imagination to guess and wonder about the way the world is, we have no way to actually test and find out that the world is that way. That's like a fairly surprising thing for people. And the fact of the matter is, good scientists are always working with multiple hypotheses, which means they're working with multiple versions of reality that we're working out our heads, and I'm trying to figure out how to make sense of it with the data. And I think, and that's actually where I think the best scientists, I think we end up really being rewarded for our creativity and our imagination. That's the first thing. And the second thing, I want to get your response to it, is that even when we kind of do that, there's a certain point, just because we're humans as scientists too, is that we have to overlay narratives on top of these facts. And when I think about evolution, that's been a place where there's been a lot of narratives laid on top of it that may or may not be demanded by the evidence. And there's other ways to tell the story too. And a lot of times I see the conflict that people say they have with evolutionary science is really with the discardable parts of the narrative. They're not actually with what the core of science is telling us in evolution. And I wonder if like a better response is to go retell those stories rather than to dispute the science. I don't know. So those are the thoughts that I had. I'm kind of
No, that's why I think your book does such a great job, is because you do take your argument, which is that you do believe in evolution, and you believe the science supports it, but you also believe in the scriptures, and you're seeking, how do I integrate those and understand them in a way that they're both held truthful, and also to address some of the classic doubts that many Christians have, that they're not reconcilable. And the way you do it in that book, which I really appreciated, is you don't just sit there and try to, rattle off the scientific facts and boom, 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 and here's where evolution is right, and here's where this is wrong, or whatever. It's you actually try to incorporate into the narrative that we do have within the Christian church, but you also show a sensitivity to the understanding that there's a variety of traditions. And so you sort of go down a couple different lines of traditions to show, here's how it might work with this tradition, this understanding. And that is what makes the book so compelling, in my opinion. And I appreciate that, But one of the things I wanted to mention too was, of course, you would know this more than I, just from my readings in the past. Haven't a lot of scientific advances originated in, like, sort of, what do they call it? Just sort of sparks of imaginations, of ideas of scientists. What if it's this way? Or they have a dream and they wake up. Isn't there a lot of examples like that?
Examples like that. I mean, I think people go back to Einstein a lot, because basically there's these puzzles. Science we can get at, like, observations, right? That are kind of like these shadows of reality. But we don't ever get to see reality directly. I mean, we're dealing with, we don't know if it's just like a bug in our computer code, or like an aberration in the lens, or
brains in a vat,
or something going on. I mean, well, we're getting observations, and we're seeing patterns. We don't know what's causing those patterns, and we don't always see the patterns. We're trying to find out how to do that. And we're trying to get some sort of model of reality that would explain what we're seeing. But the thing about it is, the reality is often very bizarre. It is not what fits our intuitions. And so, we have kind of our normal way of thinking about things that we're kind of plodding along with and doing well. And that just doesn't always make sense of it. And that's actually what was so interesting, for example, about Einstein, is that he took these facts that everyone knew about in physics. Okay. The fact that, from all observers seemed to see that light was always moving at the same speed. That was fairly well established. Now, we didn't know that for sure. Maybe like a better instrument, we'd see a slight difference. But there was a couple of very clear, experiments that had come out that show that was really the case. And he just started to work out, well, what's the reality that, what's the imaginative reality that we don't know about yet, that if it were true, it would explain that feature. And then if that is the reality, well, then let's kind of take the thought experiment further. What else would it mean? And then in his miracle year, he ends up publishing, four papers. I think 2 or 3 of which were just like really playing that imagination game forward. And it turns out that, it would take, years and decades, or even about a century, until some of the key predictions that he made were really satisfied. But that, it turns out, the way how he imagined reality, which seems so foreign and bizarre at the time, turns out to be actually how it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I am familiar with, as are most people now, because it's become so well known, as the Flatland story, and I think that Flatland story has done more help as a story narrative embodying that understanding for many of us.
Like in the 1800s about many dimensions, right?
Yeah. And so quantum physics has used that to help us to break through our own sort of barriers of understanding. So there's another good example.
I think the best of science is kind of like it. Like I'm telling you, there's many aspects of science, but I think one thing that drew me to science, and what I've always admired is about a lot of the great scientists out there, is how imagination really plays into it. How, there's stuff that's just been sticky, that, we have a certain way of looking about it, or maybe a set of certain ways that are looking at it that get us so far, but they get a breakthrough, honestly, by just kind of reconceiving what reality is. And they end up being, right in important ways. And it takes creativity to pull that off.
That's why I think it's a really dishonest and a false dichotomy that sadly many scientists perpetuate the myth, that it is this sort of like, well, there's religion and imagination on one side, and that's all fine and fancy and subjective, but science is the absolute empirical, means of knowing real truth. And that narrative itself is just like self-contradictory, you know? And
well, I mean, so most scientists will agree, and if they don't, they really need to get with the program. Is you can't actually tell, you know, whether or not racism is wrong from science. There's no experiment to tell us, for example, if racism is wrong or if raping people is wrong.
Yeah,
there's no. I mean, like these are. You can't get that, and most of us in science thankfully understand that those things really are wrong. But how did we come to that knowledge? It wasn't by science. And so if that's true, then we have to acknowledge that science is not the only way of understanding the world, and it can't be the only way, right?
Yeah. And so the goal is how do we integrate, you know? And like from my own personal journey, you know, I had, like I said, you know, I've always been an artist. So I was kind of a bipolar person, you know, where I had this side of me that I loved and enjoyed imagination, but my faith was more intellectual, apologetics oriented, philosophical. And many Christians do live in this sort of dichotomy because we're afraid of seeking to understand how the imagination applies to our faith, to our religious beliefs, because many of us are under the mistaken notion that imagination is some kind of a bad thing or some kind of a, you know, it's rooted in flights of fancy, or it's rooted in something that's not certain, or the scriptures, the Bible aren't like that, you know? And so they have a false picture of the Bible itself. But when you study the Bible, and I did this survey, I went through the whole Bible, and I came to the conclusion that I basically looked through all the texts and just looked at the various sort of, you know, discourses in the Bible. And I came to the conclusion that about 20%, at most 30, you could argue, is propositional truth, you know, the rational discourse, but about 70 to 80% of it is actually poetry, storytelling.
But even though propositional truths are embedded in a narrative, right?
Absolutely. And by the way, it's not it's not an either or, it's a both and. In fact, if you read a lot, that was one of the amazing things, you know, you read a lot of these texts, and they are talking about, in scripture, they're talking about historic events. A lot of them, if you look at the prophecies, you know, like in the Old Testament, when they're talking about when Babylon is going to come and bring Israel away to exile, you know, you read these descriptions of, like, you know, the sky will roll up like a scroll and all the stars will fall from heaven. And you realize, well, it's talking about an actual historical event, but it's not literal. It's actually metaphorical about the fall of earthly and heavenly powers. It's that, you know, they had this belief in the ancient world that the earthly authorities were connected to spiritual authorities or principalities over them. So that if there was a war between nations, for example, on earth, there was also a war in heaven between their principalities, because they understood that over these various nations were these various supernatural entities that were sort of their powers, right? And so consequently, when they're describing an earthly event like Babylon's, you know, destruction of Jerusalem, you know, there's all this language of you know, collapsing universe. And even so far as in Jeremiah, it talks about that when the temple and Jerusalem is destroyed, he describes it as if it's a return to Genesis 1, the pre-creation chaos. He literally says, all is empty and void. The same exact language in Genesis 1, right? All is empty and void. There are no man. There's no man. There's no bird. There's no. It's like it's like when the temple is destroyed. The temple is sort of this spirit, you know, spiritual embodiment of the cosmos for the Jewish mind. Well, that would be like destroying the universe to them, right? So they use that kind of language. And then once you understand how it's used and poetically integrated, you can say, well, it's not denying history. It's not saying, it's not just, you know, just figurative or symbols without reference. It actually is rooted in historical reference, but the ancient writers would blend that together. The truth is, I mean, even modern writers do too. I mean, how many of us talk about how, you know, 9/11, you know, was the end of the world. You know, we use this language to describe dramatic changes in history. We use dramatic, extreme imaginative language, and we integrate it. You know.
So, a question I wanted to ask you is, and we talked about this a little bit already, but what makes a good story? Like what are the features? Like what are it's like some objective things you could kind of say, well, this is what a story is. And
yeah,
that makes it good.
Yeah, no, there actually are elements of that. And forgive me, but I have to plug my other book, which is Hollywood Worldviews, which is my book where I do actually go through the components of storytelling, because I want Christians and religious people to understand the nature of how storytelling works.
And too, like, what is a story exactly?
Right.
What is a story?
And so I go through some of that. And for example, a classical storytelling. Now, there are different storytelling structures, but I would argue that the basic Western storytelling is rooted in a Judeo-Christian worldview. And it basically, you have, if you boil it down to its most primitive element, I would say, you could say it's all stories have a creation, fall, redemption motif. And you could argue creation, fall, redemption, consummation, right? And what that means is there's an understanding or a depiction of the world in the story, and most stories will focus on a singular protagonist. It could be several, but primarily the dominant means is a protagonist and their normal world. In other words, what was life before this story began? What would be the ideal existence? But the problem is that something has occurred that has ruined that ideal, that creation notion, and that's the fall. And that means there's something wrong in the character's life. And then the character journeys, has a goal or a desire, something they want really bad. And that goal is embodied, that goal is a sort of an outward goal, but it embodies an inner spiritual meaning. So just to use an example, so it's not all abstract here, let's take Braveheart, for example, right? So Braveheart's one of my favorite movies of all time, and most people have seen it. And, there's a story where, like, the normal life is, William Wallace has this, sort of dark history with his family, but he basically goes off and comes back, and his normal world is he wants to have a family and just, live on the land and have a family. That's sort of a universal desire that we all have, right? But the fall comes when, the king invades the land, tries to take the men's wives, and William Wallace refuses to do that. So they catch his wife and kill her. Well, that's the fall in his life. And then that turns him into a man of war, who he then battles. And his goal is he wants to kick the King of England out of Scotland. That's his goal. He wants something strong, right? But that goal represents something deeply meaningful, like freedom, right? So these are the universal themes. And so as the hero or the protagonist is the technical term, as the protagonist seeks to accomplish his goal, he's got all these obstacles to block him, to block his ability. And that's the story. Will he get to his goal? It keeps being stopped. But the obstacles build to the point where it looks as if the protagonist is not going to achieve their goal, and they're going to lose all. And in some points, sometimes the hero sort of returns to his old self, and because of that, he loses something, a life, a friend's life, or something like that, or there's a death of some kind. But it forces the protagonist then to realize his internal flaw that's inside him is what's keeping him ultimately from the outer goal he wants. So he wants something like freedom. He wants to kick the King of England out of Scotland. He wants freedom, but he wants it for revenge instead of for justice or for the rest. And for William Wallace, the moment when he realizes that is when he's in the jail, and he realizes that he's not going to accomplish his goal of freeing Scotland through war. He's going to accomplish it through sacrifice. And that's in a way, that's the gospel. That's the reflection of the gospel, right? And so his death becomes the inspiration that then creates the final battle for the protagonist is the end of the story. Will they achieve their goal or not? And then if they do achieve it, we see that, the world is better because of it.
So that's helpful in terms of like looking at Braveheart. But once again, I'm thinking about science. Help me understand how I'm thinking about this with science. So what I would say, I mean, you're an expert in stories, so I'm a little nervous to talk to you about this, but just give me a moment and bear with me. I'd say like a distinction between like propositional truth as a starting frame versus a story. Story really does have a timeline in it. There is like a before, after, there's like events in a sequence that are happening. And that it has themes, it has motifs, and it speaks to things that are actually bigger than just the actual material things they're talking about. I think those are key things about a story. And there's a progression, and wherever you leave off in the story, it's also presumed usually that the story is going on in some way or another, and we don't always know how. And even when we pick up, there's a presumption that it would have been going on before then. So it's kind of talking about a reality that kind of extends even beyond what you're actually dealing with. So when I think about science, I mean, we look at very narrow things, right? And then we make conclusions. When I think about, for example, the narratives of evolution, there isn't a hero. There is not a hero's journey, though sometimes we might think about the scientists that are discovering stuff as a hero. I'm not. Well, you know, that is actually a potentially interesting angle to look at it. But if you look at the actual science itself of evolution, you know, what you're talking about is a progression of things that have happened that have an end. And at the same token, we'll talk about the character. We'll say that it's like sometimes it'll be said that it's an entirely random process. That's like almost a metaphysical statement that we can't get scientifically, right? And it is really an origin creation story about how things got to be the way they are, and it's a grand story, and it seems to exclude elements that a lot of other people have thought of as important. Like, it doesn't talk about God, but there's other ways it's been glossed too. People talk about how evolution is really read in tooth and nail, and once again, there is very clearly, especially in evolution, there is like a progression. There is a timeline involved and a progression of forms. And so, for example, it's really common to note that, you know, humans are incredibly recent in the world's history, that the Earth has been around here for 4 billion years. Yet here we are just, you know, at most a few 100,000 years that modern humans arrive. And so that does speak to something about our significance in a way that undermines the way how we tend to think about ourselves. So are those stories too, or am I misunderstanding them?
Oh, sure. I mean, there, you know, what I was saying was sort of understanding some of the components of basic storytelling, but there are other simpler ways, like, you know, what you were saying in its most primal element. A story is a sequence of events through time. Sure, you can say that, but I think there's more to it than that. And how do you embody your themes within your story? Well, you actually did it in your book in the sense that, you know, you were actually telling a creation, fall, redemption story.
Yeah.
And you were trying to make sense of that with the evolutionary narrative, which is one of the primary problems from the Christians like us who do not accept the evolutionary narrative. That's the thing you have to overcome. You have to explain that creation, fall, redemption narrative, and show how evolution makes sense with it, because the arguments on the outside of that is that it doesn't. If morality is evolving, then there is no absolute morality. And how does that work with a God who, you know, I'm not saying there aren't answers. I'm just saying those are the answers you have to address. And you did address a lot of them in your book, because you're trying to make sense of it.
You know, a lot of people have said if evolution is true, and this isn't just anti-evolution people, you know, atheists have said this, right? Who affirm evolution, that, you know, if evolution is true, that means there is no absolute morality.
Yeah.
And that is a story they're telling. That I don't know how they can say that. I mean, that's not what science says, and that might be their beliefs. I mean, perhaps we can even grant that it might be true, but it's not like science tells us that. That's the story they're telling, and maybe the conflict is more with that story than actually what the evidence shows. And, you know, I guess the question I wanted to raise to you is really related to this. You're talking about my book. You know, I think it's been interesting. A lot of young Earth creationists have read it and really liked it. A lot of old Earth creationists have too. And the way I presented it is as a thought experiment. And even I would say atheists have read this thought experiment that talks about Adam and Eve liked it too. The way how I did that is by just saying, okay, so this is a story where we can meet and kind of imagine something together. And we might disagree about what elements of the story are fact or fiction. Like, you know, the Christian reading this might think that evolution is totally fictional. And the non-Christian reading it might think that, you know, Adam and Eve are totally fictional. Fine. At least it's still the same story that we can be in together. Kind of go play this together. And it's been interesting how some people would say, but I don't want to enter a story that's not true, which is so weird, because we do that all the time when we go to the movies. Why wouldn't we want to do that about something like this? Like,
sure.
Can you make sense of that? Or
yeah, no, I do think that's sort of the vestiges of what I would call the modernist paradigm that has infected a lot of, you know, modern religious people. Is, you know, they have this false assumption of what I would argue is that, you know, the turn of the century when liberalism came out, that's when Christians began to assume the same sort of
liberalism. I think you mean is more like modern. It was a modernist, really.
Modernist, yeah, modernist. They call themselves liberalism back then, but and the fundamentalism
different than the liberalism of today. There's like a distinction. So
sure, you could argue that. So, but the fundamentalism is what rose to defend the Bible against that liberalism or the modernity of that time. But it accepted the modernist assumptions, which is, that the Bible is speaking with absolute modern scientific categories, modern historical categories, which is itself is a imposed narrative, right? And because of that, then they do tend to have trouble accepting the more imaginative considerations like you're talking about, But I do think honestly, I would say, I believe that there's less and less of that. I would call that the vestiges of fundamentalism, which is dying out because it cannot, fundamentalism, this rigid, the Bible has to have the kind of preciseness and, absolute sort of understanding that we have in the modern world. It can't hold. And people are seeing this and it's dying out in my opinion, but
Well, a lot of people collapse evangelicals with fundamentalists, but they are very distinct movements.
Very different. Yeah.
Evangelicalism of quote unquote, the more, traditional conservative sort, I don't think is on the downswing at all, but fundamentalism, I think it is more troubled.
Well, but here's what's so great, what your book does is that you actually bring, because you're arguing for the quote literal two people, Adam and Eve, that's the one thing that's been assaulted so much, and you're actually giving intellectual weight to that proposition.
I'm saying you're saying that's important. Well, then come along with us.
Yeah.
It's important. And I think that's been a bit puzzling for them.
Sure. Absolutely. So that you are entering into both stories, the evolution story and the Christian story, and helping both sides to try to come together. And I think it's you do a pretty good, compelling job of that.
Well, I think it's both ways too. I mean, we can talk about, I really do think that the only way to really sustain young earth creationism is to kind of go off in a branching reality that is disconnected from how everyone else around you sees it. That's like the only way to sustain it. That's why they have their own university systems. That's why they have creation science and things like that. It's just a branching reality. And I think we can attack it on scientific or evidential grounds, but I think the fact that it is a branching reality should be concerning in and of itself.
Sure.
But I think the opportunity, for them is to say, well, maybe a lot of these concerns that we really care about could actually make sense alongside science. But then the other way to look at it too is that, I think most of the secular world has really, given up on biblical narratives.
Yeah.
And I got to say, I think that there's something very important about biblical narratives even if you're secularist, even if you're convinced that scripture is not true, that are important for engaging the most pressing realities we have right now. If you look at, for example, racism, it's not surprising to me that Martin Luther King was camped out in theological stories. And that had a huge impact. And it wasn't merely because you need to just kind of deal with the religious people, so you got to talk in religious ease to get them. What he was talking about in the stories he talked about resonated with non-Christians too. It's this weird thing where like atheists are concerned about if we're really considering, African Americans in the image of God too. But they don't even believe God exists. Like, how does that happen? It's because there's something powerful about that story.
Well, plus I think now after years and years of like the Bible's been so neglected culturally in our culture that many people just don't even know what's in the Bible. It's actually a fresh story to start, retelling the biblical stories to people is actually kind of fresh, It's like, oh, that sounds interesting. And it's almost like they're hearing it outside of the context. In the past, it's always been the, Bible is religious fundamentalists and it's not true, whatever. But now it's just sort of like, it's just one of many. And most people don't even know what's in the Bible anymore. So, you can make reference to things and they don't even know. So they're just now the uneducated masses now, whether it's, millennials or the Gen Z, whatever, it's like they just don't even know about it. So when you're telling them, I think there's a sort of they're coming at it more fresh and, in many ways. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, like if you look at the big themes in Genesis, right? So I mean, if you look at the secular story, really, you could probably call it as a story of secular progress and technological progress. That's really what the big grand arc of history is. And I don't think that that's false necessarily, but if you look at the story of Scripture, it's a story of a fall that has technological progress within it. Genesis really is about technological progress too. But it's like an undermined sort of progress that has an ambiguous moral character.
Yeah. And but again, I would argue too that actually the secular worldview also has creation, fall, redemption. This is the common. I think the most primary understanding of storytelling is creation, fall, redemption, and consummation, I would add, but at least create the three acts, like Aristotle's 3 acts, right? If you can remember it, creation, fall, redemption. Everybody has that kind of a view. It's just different for different worldviews. So for the secular worldview, which is oftentimes humanistic, that view is that, creation is the creation motif for them is, that it's a world without God. And the fall is when man becomes religious. He uses God as a means to oppress others. And so redemption is freeing ourselves from the religious chains, becoming secular and realizing that there's no meaning, purpose to everything, right?
Okay, there's that too, but there's many stories. So I think
there is, but I mean, in a primal sense, that's a secular worldview, and that is a worldview that a lot of people have in our culture, and I know because I see their stories, I study their stories, and that's what they're saying,
Sure.
So in that sense, though, I guess what I'm arguing is that the creation, fall, redemption is inherently Christian, but part of the being in the image of God is that I think everybody draws from a certain amount of truth, whether they know it or not. So in like Romans 1, it says that we have a knowledge of God within ourselves because we're in God's image, but we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And so I think that's why I would argue basic storytelling in and of itself reflects Judeo-Christianity. In fact, it's really funny because I had a debate years ago with some famous screenwriters online and stuff. And, they were literally, I was arguing this very thing, that storytelling itself actually reflects the Judeo-Christian view. And they're like, no way, what are you talking about? I said, well, look,
there's in the Bible. In other cultures, there's stories in India, there's stories in Africa, there's stories.
Right. But we're all created by the same God who is known in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, right? And so consequently,
storytelling is kind of part of what makes us human. Now, as a Christian, you think that comes from Christianity, but you can't say that that's uniquely Judeo-Christian, right? That's not what you're arguing.
I would argue that. Oh, I would be, and the reason why is because philosophically, you cannot justify that within the other philosophical paradigms. Now, you'd have to walk through each of them to prove the point, but right now, I'm just sort of trying to state the point, which is, we are creating the image of God, and we have that truth, but we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And so I think, like Francis Schaeffer would talk about this, where that image of God bubbles up, and sometimes it's reflected whether we know it or not. And thus, we have a lot of Hollywood storytelling by atheists or people who hate God. And in many ways, they reflect sometimes the truth without even realizing it, right? But yeah, I would say that the creation, fall, redemption motif is a motif that all philosophies and worldviews and religions have, but my argument would be that it ultimately reflects the biblical worldview. But that's an extended discussion.
Yeah, that is an extended one. That'd be interesting to explore. I'm not convinced, but maybe you're right. Maybe you're onto something. So let
me just give you one example. So, for instance, if you want to have an atheistic worldview or something, you can't justify that. Why? Because there is no creation state, meaning a state from which there's a fall. There's just randomness and molecules, running into each other, right? So there is no sense of a fall. It's the same argument that you make as a Christian when you say, the atheist says, what are you talking about? I can have morality and believe and be an atheist. That's ridiculous. Well, yeah, you can. You have the morality because you're creating God's image, and in your spirit or soul or whatever you want to call it, you have a sense of right and wrong. But your atheism does not comport with it, which means if your atheism is true, there is no morality. So you are living a complete fairy tale when you say there is right and wrong, and your own belief system doesn't justify it. And that's what I'm arguing is that.
This is getting into a complex territory. I mean, I have a lot of friends. I'm friends with a lot of atheists, and we talk about this sometimes. I think that,
so from a Christian worldview, my argument is that,
so that's true from a Christian worldview. It's just that they're not coming from that,
and their worldview
justification for it. So we have to engage their story, like you're talking about.
Absolutely,
but engage their story, engage it. And I think the way I would do it is like you talked about the way how they do talk about creation, fall, and redemption. And about how religion has been such a problem, and frankly, don't you have to agree with them on some level about that? I mean, if you look at what religion has done, it has been a way how people have exerted inappropriate power over one another and done a lot of damage in the world.
Mm-hmm. But if atheism is true,
I can agree with that.
If atheism is true, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything. It's not right, wrong. It's not good, bad. It's just molecules colliding with other molecules. That's all it really is. So to assign any kind of moral value is itself a rejection of atheism. And the fact that they
would call themselves secular humanists. So it wouldn't be merely atheism. So they would make a distinction between themselves, between kind of like, psychopathic atheists or reductive atheists and those that are humanists. So, and
I know they tried. The main point is that if your philosophical foundation provides no legitimacy to morality, then that's showing that you're wrong in the sense of arguing for morality. Now you can say, I believe in morality. That's fine. You can believe in morality, but your philosophical view does not provide the necessary preconditions.
I think what you're trying to say, the way I would put it, is that you're saying that the philosophical grounding from only atheism leaves you with something to be desired, and I'd agree with that. I think though we have to be careful to make sure that they can enter that story too with us. So I'm just sensitive because it's funny. I mean, at the end of the book, I ended it with this point. Now, this isn't picking on you at all, but I kind of addressed secular scientists. I addressed, evolutionary creationists, or the non-traditionalists, I call them, and I addressed the traditionalists. But with the atheists, it's funny. I had some exchanges with Jerry Coyne. He's a pretty anti-religious atheist, and I was really struck actually when I engaged with him about how concerned he was about how Christians talked about atheists. And he was really sensitive about it. And, he's kind of a pretty, thick-skinned guy who can dish it out. And I was really surprised, actually. As I looked at it, it made a lot more sense to me where he's coming from. Because, I think when it comes down to it, Christians don't always treat atheists like they're our neighbor. We don't treat them rhetorically at minimum, right? As if they're our friends. We treat them like they're our enemies. And I think that really does a lot of damage. And frankly, a lot of atheists can be friends and allies to us about things that we really care about, even though we disagree about important things. And I'm not saying anything you said necessarily undermines that, but
no, absolutely. You and I are a different discussion than you and I than me with an atheist.
Well, they're in the discussion too, listening in, right? So
yeah, but again, I'm speaking rationally. I'm not imputing any kind of you're an evil, you're atheist, you're a bad person. And I'm just saying, it's great that you believe in morality, and that's good, but your philosophy doesn't provide the necessary preconditions for the intelligibility of reality or the morality you're saying. So doesn't that give you some cognitive dissonance that maybe you need to reconsider it? I mean, isn't that what we're doing when we're, engaging in, discussions?
When I talk to atheists, I don't get the sense that they're as concerned about like airtight logical coherence, because in this way, I don't think they're actually modernists right now. I think the things that really concern them is they see a lot of real injustice in the world, and they see a all too often that the church is a barrier to that. I mean, it's actually, when you look at the new atheists, they didn't make a logical argument against God. They made a moral argument against God.
Yeah.
They didn't say that God was illogical. They said, well, that God is immoral. And I think that is honestly how a lot of atheists look at Christianity. And I can't say that I entirely disagree, because I look at a lot of Christianity that does seem pretty immoral. We don't have to enumerate the examples, and I hope you know what I mean. I mean, there's stuff in the news right now about it. But I think what they're really waiting for is, to quote scripture, is waiting for the revealing of the sons of God, sons and daughters of God, where we're actually living a different sort of life that, you know, that is really righteous. I think that would have a much bigger impact if they saw real resources in the Christian faith to encounter, for example, the racism in St. Louis, where I live. I think they would see things differently. I mean, that's kind of the missing piece of the puzzle. That even when it's there in the Christian faith, I think it's been hard for them to access and to see. Does that make any sense?
Sure. Yeah, and I think the methods and the means by which we all engage in interactions, you know, differ person to person. I think it depends on a lot on the persons you're talking to. But if you are speaking to an atheist who does believe that God in the Bible is immoral, like Richard Dawson, right? You know, don't you, you know, as much as you might want to say, oh, you know what, I would agree with you that a lot of Christians act like jerks or this, that, but isn't your goal to communicate to him, however you do that, but God's not immoral? I mean, you know, and
oh yeah, but I
you know, I mean, like,
yeah, I think that's also a fairly, you know, absurd argument. I mean, there's a certain point where, you know, you engage like meaningful arguments. The idea that the God of the Bible is immoral really has to depend on a lot of misreading of scripture.
Right. But my point is that, but you don't, you know, you have to address that, because this is a real thing that a lot of, you know, a lot of people do believe that, and it is absurd, but a lot of people believe a lot of absurd things. And so my point is that you
Sure.
you would agree with them where you can agree, and then you do the twist through narrative or however you tell this story or whatever, you know, where you basically are communicating, yeah, I agree with you that whatever, like whatever these Christians might be doing or bad, or what have you.
We've talked about propositional truth. We've talked about story, but I do think another component of it is kind of like the embodied truth too, right?
Sure.
So I think, and remember, like when I talk about scientists, I'm not talking about like the abstract idea archetype of a scientist. I'm talking about real people that, you know, I know and I care about. And so I do think we need to talk about propositional truth. I do think we need to talk about stories, but I think the gospel, the message of the gospel goes out with messengers. I think that's actually a core teaching. There's this component of it where the words don't necessarily have to change, but it's meaningful that's being brought by people. And I think a key part of that, and I think a key part of that is, like, you know, when my colleagues that are scientists look at me, they don't actually, I don't think they see me first as a Christian. I think they see me first as one of them, as a scientist. That and then, you know, beyond that, they see me as a person who's deeply concerned about the things going on in society that they are also very concerned about too. And these are like very deep concerns. They see me as one of them, I think. At least I hope. At least the ones that I get along with, right? That's kind of the starting point. And
you're in a good position. I mean, not a lot of people have that. I come from a world where it's the opposite, actually. You know, when people would discover that I'm a Christian, they would actually hate me and reject me. That's the world of Hollywood, and literally just, you know, completely, you know, just write you off and not talk to you. So we have to be very strategic, very each world that we're in, we have to deal with differently.
There's like some strong stereotypes what a Christian is. I mean, there was like some interesting studies where they looked at what scientists thought about Christians and religious people. They actually had no problem with the religious people, but they had a problem with fundamentalists, and they thought that evangelicals are fundamentalists.
And listen,
so that's a problem.
I know. So I can tell you stories in my own life and friends where that's what happened with us in Hollywood, is because we're very strategic. Like you say, we have to deal with people as people and not logic machines. Absolutely. And so what often happens is when they do find out you're a Christian, because they've known you're like, they're surprised. They're like, you are? I thought Christians were uncool, and I've heard that happen many times. And that's where the value is, the character of the apologist. If you're going to do apologetics or defend the faith, you have to take into consideration the character, your own character, and how you're interacting with people, because you do have to be sensitive to them, even if they are blinded. You have to have patience. You have to be strategic. But the reality is, every person is different, and each situation requires something. Like if you look at Jesus, there are people who, he would deal with differently than others. And a lot of it has to do with the situation and what, intuitive sense of who you're talking to, So we all these things come into play, all of them.
But I would agree with you, but I think we have to be very careful as Christians about telling stories that have the atheist as a villain. I think that is extremely destructive. Look, I know that they tell stories that have the Christian as a villain. I've heard those stories, those stories, but I think that we're not supposed to tell stories that has the atheist as the villain. Mm-hmm. I think we need to be very cautious about that, because that's happened for a long time. It's very alienating.
I think I would agree.
And frankly, not just the atheists. I'd say we have to be cautious about telling stories that has the scientists as the villain. They're our neighbor too. And, I got to tell you, as a Christian in science, that they've shown me great kindness. In a lot of ways, they've been like the Samaritan that has taken care of me. And I'm not saying that I agree with them or anything. I'm not a Christian. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. I believe that God exists, and I want them to know him. But they're not my enemy. They really, really are not my enemy. Does that make any sense?
I agree with you completely on a philosophical level. But in terms of storytelling and in a culture, you would actually be prejudiced and bigoted if you never have a scientist who's a villain, because all people can be villains. It's just a matter of what is the story you're telling. So let me give you an example. So if I were to tell a story where the main, one story a story focuses on a particular theme or message, right? And you can't address everything. So if I'm telling a story,
that we don't ever have scientists as a villain, but
I know, but that's what I'm reacting to.
Is always cast into the villain role.
Oh, okay.
You never have a redemptive scientist.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't honestly. I don't watch Christian movies or Christian stories because I don't tend to like them, and I do think that a lot of them are goofy. But what I'm saying is, in principle, you have to understand that if I'm going to tell a story where I want to tell a story about, religion is good, but it can be bad if it's wrong, manipulated, etc. So I would tell a story, and you might have a Christian or a religious person be a villain, right? But if you want to say, well, science is good, but there are many people in society who use science as a weapon to oppress others, then I would tell that story where the scientist would end up being the villain. But to say they're a villain is not to say, oh, they're a bad, evil person. To say that, it's to say they're the antagonist, meaning in every story you have sort of the antagonist and you have the protagonist, and their worldviews are in conflict.
No,
and the struggle of those worldviews, is how you wrestle with the issues without being propagandistic. So
look, I agree with you.
Does that make sense?
No, I agree with you. What you're trying to tell is that to really do a good job, you have to tell more complex stories that kind of deal with the different sides of it. I'm agreeing with that. What I'm saying, which I think you can agree with, like you go to the apologetics world, there are stories they tell, but they're very flat, uncomplicated stories that has quite often the atheist as the villain.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That is that. In the same way, you go to atheist circles, you'll see a very flat, uncomplicated stories that has the Christian as the villain. Yeah. Look, that is not a way for us to start finding how to have a common society together in a divided world. We have to find ways to tell better stories that can incorporate people from across the aisle, that even if they're going to disagree with us on fundamentally important things in our quote unquote worldview at the end, how we can still be friends. So maybe they're going to still be an atheist, but they can be a better a better version of an atheist. Maybe I'm still going to be a Christian, but I could be a better version of a Christian, one that can actually be in community with them, right?
Yeah, I think what you may be reacting against is maybe stories you've seen where it's sort of like a propaganda or a sort of cardboard sort of caricatures of people that make them look bad, like maybe a Christian movie that shows scientists as being bad or whatever. And of course, we would all agree with that. But I think there's something deeper than the surface of what you're addressing, and that is that when we tell our stories, there is going to be antagonists and protagonists, but we need to avoid propaganda. And propaganda is when you have a singular message and you disregard opposing viewpoints. If you tell a really good story,
it's dehumanizing, frankly, right?
But if you tell a good story, you're still going to have a villain, but a good story will have incorporating multiple viewpoints and perspectives, which gives you a more complex or nuanced understanding of the truth. So let me give you an example of this. My movie that I'm most proud of is To End All Wars. And it was a true story of Allied prisoners of war under the Imperial Japanese in World War II. And now this is a very brutal true story where they suffered greatly under the Japanese. Now, what's interesting is, but my theme in the story was you have the East-West, kind of worldviews in conflict. And most Hollywood movies nowadays, East versus West ultimately means East is superior and the West has to learn how they're ignorant and oppressive, et cetera, right? But I believe both can be oppressive and that there's a higher kingdom than the kingdom of the East and the West, and that's the kingdom of God. And what happened was it has a very distinct viewpoint. The Imperial Japanese are the villains, as you say. However, I made sure that I tried to keep their dignity, try to understand within their worldview, how are they acting consistently, et cetera, such that we had a Japanese distribution company that actually distributed the movie. And they said, we did it because I had the ultimate bad guy in the camp was this samurai warrior type of guy, right? And but I portrayed his Bushido code as a code of honor, and I understood that even though what he was doing was ultimately wrong. And so that's what I mean by we need to tell our stories, and we need to have balance and a willingness to bring in these other sides. But that doesn't mean you don't have an ultimate truth that you're communicating in your story, which means there could be a story that is showing how religious people can be bad. There could be a story showing how scientists can be bad.
We're really trying to imagine our way to really understanding a complex world. We have to be really careful about oversimplifying it. We really
exactly
our stories are going to have to be complex, and they're not going to be self-aggrandizing.
Yes, but there's a problem because the different means of storytelling, sometimes, unfortunately, like you're doing a 2-hour movie, you can't be as complex as some people would like. So that's why there's many people who don't like a movie, but they like other people who do, because sometimes you can't get the full nuance that you want.
Changed, I would say, since 2010 with Netflix. I think what's happened is that movies are short actually nowadays. Now people are really interested into TV series.
I know I am. I prefer TV series to the movies precisely because
we can go on and on. I'm gonna probably have you back at some point. And I know you're starting a podcast soon too, so we should come and talk. One movie I want to talk about with you, maybe on your podcast, it's a better fit, is Battlestar Galactica. Not a movie, it's like that whole series. That they did such a great job of telling a complex story over seasons.
I've heard of that. Yeah, I haven't seen the series myself, but
you got to see that one. But I think that there is actually an opportunity, I think, in our moment to actually tell some of these more complicated stories that play out over much longer periods of time. And I think that's a good thing in the end if it gives us a better grasp on the complexities of the real world. So, we got to get going soon. We've gone a little bit long. It's been fun talking to you, Brian. Is there anything you want to tell people who are listening before we kind of close this out?
I'm sorry, what?
Is there anything you want to tell people who are listening before we close this out?
Sure. If you want to look into my books, The Imagination of God or Hollywood Worldviews or anything I've written, everything's on Amazon. All my books are
written at this point. You're very prolific.
Oh, I don't know, like 30 books or something. But Everything's at Amazon in ebook, audiobook, and paperback. Or if you want to look more into my series and stuff, my website is Godawa.com. I have everything on there about me, and it's quite an interesting website. It's not a boring one. So
if you sign up for the mailing list, you'll send them a free copy of a book, right?
Yeah.
So for your first novel, Noah Primeval, right?
I'm sorry. Did you say you're doing that?
You'll do that, right? You said if you sign up for.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm sorry, I forgot. It's been so long. Yeah, if you go to the website, there is like a little thing there where you can sign up and get my first book, Noah Primeval, for free. I actually forgot that, so thanks for reminding me.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Brian. It's really been great to have you and to talk about this.
Thanks for having me
about
Josh.
Stories and imagination, how that really relates with science, and how maybe we can tell some better stories that bring people together.
Amen.
So with that, thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you later. So let me turn this off.